The following interview is being conducted as part of the Price of Freedom Oral History Series, sponsored by the Madison County Military Heritage Commission, to inform the public of the sacrifices made by veterans in our community on battlefields around the world. We wish to thank the Huntsville School System and the ETV Broadcast Center for their help in presenting this military heritage program. Hello everyone, I'm Tom Kennemer. Thank you for being with us. Today we'll be interviewing U.S. Army veteran Paul Keil. Paul served 30 years in Army aviation, including 2 tours in Vietnam, retiring as a lieutenant colonel in 1997. For his service in our country in Vietnam, Paul was awarded the Silver Star, 2 awards of the Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 Air Medals with Valor, and the Purple Heart for wounds he received in combat. Paul, thank you very much for being with us, sir.
Thank
you for your time. Appreciate it coming up.
Thank you.
First of all, let me ask you, where are you originally? You're from Washington State, is that right?
Well, that's correct. I was born in Tacoma, Washington, although my parents moved to California when I was a baby. So I really, for all practical purposes, was raised in Southern California.
I see.
In the heydays, the 60s.
Yeah. Did you have long hair and all that sort of thing in those days, Paul, when you moved to California? In the hippie, it's kind of a hippie area, I guess.
Well, it's, you know, I don't want to sound too derogatory, but it certainly was the center of the culture where it all started. The drug, sex, and rock and roll thing.
Yeah.
But, you know, my parents went through a divorce when I was in my early teen years, and I wasn't getting a whole lot of oversight, parental oversight, so to speak. And when I graduated from high school and started college, grades were not a priority.
Right. And, let's go back to your family. You have brothers and sisters?
I do.
Yeah.
I have 2 brothers, one older and one younger. They both still live in Southern California.
Really? Okay. Were they in service also?
No, they weren't.
No. And what about, was your dad in the military?
My dad was a Marine.
Okay. Good for him. Good for him.
I know that.
He served in World War II, I would assume.
He did. He served in World War II, and you know, I was born in 1948, so I guess you'd say I was one of those post-war babies.
Right. But because your dad was in the Marines, did you envision going into the military at some point? Maybe the Marines or some other branch?
Well, not really. I didn't have a lot of plans when I ended up in the Army, although I will say that it was a retired Marine Corps aviator, one of the last flying NCOs, I used to call them the flying peons, but who convinced me that if I wanted to fly in the military, the Army Warrant Officer program was a good path to go down, because it was kind of like the Marine Corps flying NCOs.
Yeah. Now, the draft board had something to do with you going in the Army. Talk about that.
Well, it certainly did. I had a very low draft number. I went down to the induction center in Los Angeles, took all the tests, and did very well. Like I tell people, I was very, very immature, but I wasn't stupid.
Right.
So I qualified for about any school the Army had to offer. And so with the draft notice pending, I joined and went to Warrant Officer Flight School.
What was your interest in aviation? I mean, your dad was he also in aviation?
No, he was just, as far as I know, just a Marine Corps.
Always had that inkling to maybe fly at some point.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've always been excited about aircraft, airplanes, and it was a dream. Of course, there's no way I, at that point in time, would have thought that it would have been a path I could follow, because I hadn't finished college and just had a high school diploma. But in the mid-'60s, the Vietnam War was starting to gain momentum, and helicopters were the answer, and the Army was desperate for helicopter pilots.
Tell us about your training. Where did you go to train helicopter training school?
Well, when I finished basic training I had never been east of the Rocky Mountains in my life. Right. And I went to basic training at Fort Polk. Man, what a shock that was.
Louisiana, right?
Fort Polk, Louisiana. Went from there to Fort Walters, Texas. It's since closed, but that's where the Army had primary helicopter training. And then when I graduated from primary training, I went to advanced training in Savannah, Georgia at Fort Hunter Stewart. And
what kind of helicopters did you train on, Paul?
Trained initially in what was called a TH-55, a little tiny 2-person trainer.
Yeah.
And then advanced training, flew instruments in the Huey, the good old UH-1. And when I graduated from flight school, if I remember right, it was like October 8th, and I was in Vietnam by October 25th.
So you went directly to Vietnam?
Yeah, it was very, very quick. Didn't get much leave.
Yeah, yeah. Before we talk about the military action you were involved with, let's talk about what it was like when you first got to Vietnam. Did you go immediately into combat, or you have like 2 weeks or a month training before you actually go into on missions, that sort of thing?
Well, it didn't take very long to get into combat. There was no real training per se, other than what they'd call as a quick in-country orientation flight. I think that the senior instructors would kind of evaluate how comfortable you were to fly the aircraft, whether or not you needed to fly with an instructor pilot for a longer period of time, or you could just start flying with a regular line pilot. And I
needed pilots, so they
needed pilots. So I took the in-country check ride with a senior instructor pilot, and he immediately cleared me to fly with any other aircraft commander. And I was in the 1st Air Cav Division. And the 1st Cav, shortly after I arrived, moved from the northern part of Vietnam up in the I Corps area down to 3 Corps. And the unit I was in moved from what was Camp Evans to Phuc Vinh.
Okay. Now describe what part of the country again was that? Is that northern part of Vietnam, or is that southern around Saigon, or that area?
Where I arrived, Camp Evans was up in the northern part of the country.
Okay.
What they refer to as I Corps, 1st Corps.
Okay.
And then we moved down near, kind of along the Cambodian border in 3 Corps. Basically, I think they were afraid of, or they wanted to make sure that a Tet of 1968, when there were a lot of infiltration, got across the border and came down into the Saigon area. They wanted to make sure that didn't happen again. So the 1st Cav was deployed along the Cambodian border and major infiltration routes.
This was like in '69,
late '68, early '69.
I see. Okay.
And we just basically ensured that there wasn't going to be any large enemy force get down to the Saigon area again.
What type of helicopter did you fly there? Would you start out with the Hueys there? Or
yes. Yeah, I arrived in Vietnam and flew the Huey. That was, just the general workhorse, just like you see it in the movies or read about it in the books. They did everything with them. Some of them were armed, some were primarily carrying cargo. Of course, there was medevacs, and I flew in what was called an assault helicopter company, which just did everything.
Tell us about your typical mission. You'd go out and you'd have guns on the Huey, and what would you do?
Well, 2 primary missions. One would be air assault, and that would be taking troops into combat. And you've seen that often probably in the movies.
Right.
And the other primary mission would be generally supporting and supplying those units that were maneuvering in the field. Of course, in air assault, you might be in anywhere from 4 or 5 to 10 aircraft taking troops into a landing zone, whereas normally when you fly resupply and general ash and trash type missions supporting units as they were maneuvering in the field, you were single ship. So, hollowing, beans, bullets, water in, and bringing, in many cases, people, sometimes wounded people out. That was kind of a typical day if you were on a single ship mission. And then, of course, air assaults were very, very highly coordinated with artillery and with gunships. Like 6 to 10 aircraft would go in, and in the latter part of my tour, I became what they call the Yellow One, a flight lead for the 1st Cav Division. I led a lot of those air assaults.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Now, you served 2 tours, and what did you do mostly on the 2nd tour? What was?
Well, the 2nd tour was very unusual. In fact, if you flash back not too many years, I wouldn't even really be able to talk about it, but I basically flew electronic surveillance. It was fixed-wing aircraft. It's called a JU or an RU-21. and almost all of my flying was in Cambodia and Laos, very little over Vietnam.
I see, yeah. Was that like you came home and stayed a year and went back, you know, and what was it, like 11 months or 12 months a tour?
12-month tours were typical.
Right.
It would be very unusual for them to be shorter than that.
Right.
Let's see, I came back in late 1969, and when Vietnam started to draw down, I was selected for fixed wing course, went to the fixed wing school, and then I had orders for Vietnam to go back a second time in '72, and those were canceled.
Right.
And I ended up staying at Fort Rucker, Alabama for almost a year.
You're a training pilot? Did you train other pilots?
Yeah, that's when I was. Well, actually, most of that time I was an instructor pilot. Part of it in helicopters and part of it in airplanes, and at the flight schools.
Right.
And then I got reactivated to go back to Southeast Asia. Went to this airborne radio direction finding school at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, and went and flew these electronic aircraft. Actually lived in Thailand. I lived right up on the Laotian border in northern Thailand, and flew in, like I say, Laos and Cambodia most of the time.
Not the proper word, but was this more interesting than the first tour, or what?
Well, it was totally different than the first tour, that's for sure.
A lot of different, yeah.
I was living in a, you know, kind of like an air-conditioned apartment house at night, whereas when I was over there on the first tour, you're kind of in a dilapidated tent-like building.
Yeah, yeah.
But we were all by ourselves, single ship, flying, you know, with 20/20 hindsight, probably pretty stupid missions, but we were flying way up, you know, not far from the North Vietnamese, the Chinese, the Burmese borders, you know, tracking units electronically that were moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and things.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, it's important work, you know, yeah. Let's get back to that first tour. Paul, talk about when you had some downtime, what'd you do for relaxation? You slept in a tent? I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of, like, five-star restaurants and that sort of thing around close by. So what did you guys do? Play poker? Did you?
Lots of poker, and, you know, unfortunately, well, I wanted to fly as much as I could. The more I flew, the faster time went. So, you know, I flew, but, you know, when you were down, you know, lots of beer, very, very seldom refrigerated, usually warm.
Yeah.
And lots of poker. And
have a movie, have a screen that you can have a movie occasionally, I guess.
Yeah, we'd watch a movie and sitting out, you know, on a sandbag in a field to watch a movie.
Yeah.
But you know, all outside latrines. Food was terrible.
You didn't care too much for the sea rations deal, huh? Not too many hot meals either, right?
Well, certainly not during the day. We'd usually get back in the evening after missions and get one hot meal in a mess hall. But
yeah. Now, wasn't it great to receive a letter when you're over there? And of course, it's a lot different from today. I mean, we didn't have email and that sort of thing. So talk about what a letter meant to you, you know, when you received a letter from... And were you married at that time?
No, I was single.
Okay.
I feel sorry for my poor mother. I often say she's a saint in heaven today, but I wasn't a good letter writer myself. And she wrote me quite a bit. Some friends wrote me, sent me some books. I remember one poor guy, you know, of course, none of the computerization that we're used to today existed. One poor guy was exchanging audio tapes with his wife, the little cassette tapes, and not his wife, his girlfriend, his fiance. And I remember this poor guy getting a Dear John tape. And it took about four or 5 days before he played it for everybody. We all wrote her a letter.
Yeah, but, a real nice letter, I'm sure. Won't go into details on that.
No.
But, Paul, I know you formed lasting friendships in the service. Do you still stay in contact with a lot of your friends that you served with?
Well, I do. The particular unit I was in, Charlie Company, the 227th, 1st Air Cav, usually has a reunion about every other year. And this year there will be a reunion. I think we're going to have it over in Atlanta, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, there's a number of those guys. We still communicate by email. We send each other pictures now and then. But whenever you walk in the room with a bunch of these people that you were with in Vietnam in the 60s, you just suddenly realize, you look around how old you are.
Yeah. Is it kind of typical when we veterans get together, some of the stories are exaggerated or become different each year, that sort of thing, when we meet? That sort of thing happens, I'm sure, right?
It does. You know, I spent, as you said, I spent 30 years in the Army, and met and courted and married my wife while I was in the Army, and I kind of made a promise to her as an instructor pilot at one of the Army's flight schools. Everyone there was a combat veteran, so you'd hear stories and stories and stories and stories, and at some point in time I told my wife, I says, you know, I'm going to hang out with the ladies at these parties and stop telling stories.
Get away from that aspect of it, I'm sure you have mixed feelings, Paul, about serving in a war, but what is your favorite memory from serving in Vietnam or in the Army? You served, as you said, you served 30 years in the Army. What's your favorite memory?
Wow, that's hard to pin down. I will tell you a true story. I came home from work one day here. I was still working out on Redstone as in the engineering directorate for the engineering group, contract engineering for the Apache helicopter. And I got home and my wife handed me a note and said, you need to call this lady. And I could tell she thought it was very important, and this was 2005, I believe. And I said, what does she want to talk about? And she said she wants to talk about Vietnam. And I said, well, I really don't want to call her and talk about Vietnam. It's not something I sit around and reminisce about much. Well, I did call her, and she was a retired college professor from the University of Wisconsin, and she had gone to the National Archives and found out that I was flying a helicopter on a particular day, that I pulled her husband and some of the other people out of a hot landing zone, and she wanted me to come to a reunion. And here we are, 2005, but this is probably the best memory I have, is to walk into a room. When you're flying an assault helicopter into Vietnam, guys pile in, guys jump out. You never know.
You don't stop to take names.
Oh, no. There's no...
Right.
You have no idea who's back there. You don't know what rank they are. And all of a sudden I met these people, these men, and they were treating me like a hero for one thing, which, you know, made me a little uncomfortable. But I had one of the wives come up, and it still makes me emotional. From 2005, and she says, you know, I have a husband, 3 children, and 10 grandchildren that wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you.
For what you did, they're still here.
And I'll never forget that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I can imagine. Paul, earlier we mentioned the Valor Award you received for serving our country in Vietnam. The Silver Star was the highest award for bravery you received. Tell us about the battle or combat action that led to you receiving this award.
Well, it was that same action that there were 6 men on the helicopter that I pulled out. They were all seriously wounded. I wasn't even supposed to fly that particular day. Technically, the regulations ground you if you fly more than 120 hours in 30 days, and I was supposed to be down for 3 days. And one of our sister units had gotten into a very, very bad fight. They'd put troops on the ground. It turned out to be a hot LZ. Aircraft had been disabled by enemy fire, and the ops sergeant came and got me, and he says, Mr. Keil, you need to go fly. And the aircraft I took, I'll never forget, was brand new. Really? It was a brand new aircraft. You know how you get in a new car and it smells like new? This aircraft smelled like new. And flew down and met the air mission commander. He told me he wanted me to take troops into this LZ that we were now going in single ship. It originally had been, I think, a 3 or 4 ship LZ, but they were sending people in single ships so Cobras could escort them in.
Okay.
And took 6 troops in. The LZ was on fire. There was a lot of burning grass, smoke, everything else, and I didn't think it was all that bad, to tell you the truth. And came back. The aircraft had taken, I think, 2 or 3 minor hits, and then later that day, we were at a muster rally point. The Air Mission Commander came and asked me if I would go in again. I said, sure, I'll go in again. It was not a big deal. Well, second trip in, no fire, no smoke, and you know, as I was on short final, the big old tracer started coming right at me, and landed and took a burst of fire right through the windshield and the front panel of the aircraft. And I picked the aircraft up, and we took in ammunition, kicked off all the ammunition, and I picked the aircraft up and did a pedal turn and turned the tail towards the machine gun. I could see where the tracers were coming from. And I turned the tail towards the machine gun, and I'm sure I hollered in somewhat of a loud voice, please get the wounded on the aircraft in a hurry. I'm really getting shot up down here.
Yeah.
And I didn't do it consciously, but I guess as I moved the aircraft around to turn the tail towards the enemy, I shielded the wounded people that were being loaded on the aircraft. I will tell you, honestly, that was not pre-planned.
That was not, wasn't your first thought.
It wasn't my first thought. My first thought was I didn't want that machine gun looking right at me.
Yeah, yeah.
And so they loaded guys on. My door gunner and crew chief were firing away. One of them, I don't know which, on the intercom said, one of these guys is shot in the head, he's probably dead. And I said, well, as long as we've got power, we're going. And
sure.
Flew the aircraft for maybe 1 or 2 miles before, I mean, all the gauges were saying...
Yeah, just shot up too bad. Yeah.
Things were really bad. I mean, no engine oil pressure was had gone down, transmission oil pressure was at 0, temperatures were going hot, so I landed. And as soon as I got away from the hot LZ, and another aircraft came in and got the wounded.
And this was the brand new aircraft that you...
Yeah. It took over 60 hits. It was done. It never flew again in Vietnam.
But none of the people that came aboard were injured or after you got in the air, right? You were able to get out of there before they were wounded even more, I guess.
Well, everybody on the aircraft was wounded, except for my co-pilot. He was the only guy that he wasn't scratched. But I believe all the troops had been wounded in combat in the LZ. They were not wounded after they got on the aircraft.
Okay. Yeah.
And as it turns out, at this reunion I'm talking about in 2005, this man that had been shot in the head was alive. He had a glass eye and a steel plate, and
but he was alive.
He lived.
Yeah. And there's 6 guys that you pull.
And I talked to the medic. You know, I met everybody at this reunion. Very emotional.
I've
never gone back to another one.
Imagine,
but the medic said he had been sitting there in the brush holding this guy's head together before the aircraft came in to pick him up.
Now, was this, you were wounded, was this the time that, you know, the blast came in, the shrapnel came in and affected your helmet and your eye? Is that...
Right. I mean, plexiglass, pieces of aluminum, basically the front of the aircraft had just been shot up heavily by machine gun fire, and piece parts hit me in the face. Lesson learned from then on. When I went into a hot LZ, I always had my visor down, but my visor was up, and some of the plexiglass or aluminum had gotten into one eye. They kept me under observation for a while, but it turned out got to wear a patch.
But you're able to fly with one eye, of course. And
no, I didn't. Oh, that day?
Yeah.
Well, I tried to turn the aircraft over to my co-pilot, but he completely locked up, and so I flew it myself. With,
I see. Paul, some say it was their upbringing, others say it was a tough sergeant during boot camp. Who or what helped prepare you to take the actions you did in combat, in particular that day? I mean, what was it that made you do what you did?
Well, I firmly believe that no one can sit down and think about how they're going to, or know how they're going to react at a time like that. A lot of it is just good training. I mean, I don't necessarily want to give myself a pat on the back, but I was a really good pilot. I mean, I was an instructor pilot before I ever left Vietnam.
Right.
And so I was real comfortable handling the aircraft. And I'd been, you know, I'm not saying I was any braver than anyone else. Had I anticipated that it was going to be as bad as it really was, I'm not sure. You know, if you had time to do a lot of thoughtful analysis beforehand, I'm not sure I would have done what I did. But there was no time to do any analysis.
Bulk of it was the training, though. That was,
Bulk of it is just good training.
Yeah.
And I'd gone into the LZ once when the grass was on fire and there was a lot of smoke and it wasn't all that bad.
Experience and trainings, yeah. Now, along the same vein, describe what it's like to serve in a war zone, the thoughts you have of possibly being killed or wounded during battle. I mean, you don't think about that every time you go out on a mission, do you? Or how does that play into it, Paul?
Well, we flew a lot of night missions, or I especially flew a lot of night missions in Vietnam. And of course, this is before night vision goggles. Everything was basically with your naked eye. And I think psychologically, tracers at night are a lot scarier. And there was times when I'd be prepared to go out on one of these night hunter-killer missions, and during the pre-flight inspection of the aircraft or pre-flight planning, I'd get so nervous and so sick that sometimes I even threw up. But once you get in the aircraft, start the engine, strap in,
your mind is occupied otherwise.
Your mind is just occupied by the operation, and the fear kind of goes away, or at least it did for me. But boy, I tell you, there's times before the mission really started that I'd get very, very nervous, and like I say, almost nauseated at times.
So it's okay to be afraid or scared. I mean, that's all part of it, I guess, in the combat zone. You know, it's how you handle that, right?
Well, I'd sure get scared beforehand, sometimes in anticipation, especially on these night missions, but once you got out and started flying, everything was okay.
It went away, yeah. How do you feel, Paul, when people call you a hero or when they read about or hear about what you did in combat? How does that make you feel?
Well, you can't really describe how it makes you feel. I try real hard. In fact, you know, I've gotten pretty strong in my faith life, and I try real hard to pray for humility, because I really think that, you know, part of we've turned into a society of me, and I'm not comfortable being called a hero. I really think it's being in one place at one time and doing the right thing that you were trained to do. And I believe if you talk to anybody that received awards for valor, almost any of them will tell you I had no intention whatsoever to go be a hero.
That was not the first intention.
Oh, absolutely not.
Sure,
absolutely not. You're given a mission, you're given an expensive aircraft to fly, which was kind of fun to fly.
A job to do.
A job to do.
Yeah. Do you often wonder, would you do it all over again?
Well, you do things when you're 20 or 21 years old that you just would never do when you're, you know, I'm 70 now. I turned 70 this month. And, you know, right now you worry about things like, bills or raising kids or
arthritic elbow and that sort of thing.
Things like that.
Yeah.
And, you know, I have to take a step back and say, you know, there was times when you were worried about whether people were going to live or die, or very expensive equipment was going to be destroyed, and you have nothing to worry about right now, in comparison. So,
quite a bit of difference.
So but the word hero to me is just another word in our vocabulary, and I think most people that use it aren't necessarily intending it to. You know, you talked about somebody being, wow, you're really smart, or you're really gifted at public speaking. I mean, Okay.
Yeah.
It's a gift that God gave me.
That's right. You've served in a war, and through the years, I'm sure you've seen a few war movies. Do you think war movies are depicted accurately in most of the movies or TV shows that you've seen?
Well, I tell you, I've avoided certainly most Vietnam-era movies. I haven't seen, I don't think, any of them from beginning to end except We Were Soldiers Once, which just happened to be about the unit I was in.
Right.
The 227th was the helicopter unit that supported that operation.
Right.
That was a couple years before I got there. But I think the media has grossly exaggerated the amount of drug addiction, mental illness, depression, that is depicted in movies today. That it's, you know, everybody has PTSD, everybody has mental issues, and that's certainly not the case.
Right. There were protests during your time in service. Did you encounter any of these protests, and what was your feelings on it, and how did it make you feel? Well, I was back home, you know, from between tours and so forth.
I was in Vietnam for two big events nationally in America. One was Woodstock, and the other was when they walked on the moon. And I remember somebody bringing a newspaper article over, and one of the new guys had an article from Woodstock, and you saw these people sitting, using the American flag basically as a picnic blanket. And that kind of bothered me. I was never, you know, I talk about people being spit on or things like that. I was called a baby killer once, you know, and I really think that that's primarily a media issue. I knew I wasn't a war criminal in any form or fashion. But the thing that probably bothered me the most about the Vietnam War was, and I didn't really feel it, and I have a little envy now. You know, the job I had out on Redstone, I traveled a lot. And I saw, you know, young Private Smith walk through the airport and get applause. Well, when I was cleared for travel as a wounded warrior, so to speak, at Travis Air Force Base, they said, "You're cleared to travel, don't travel in uniform." And you know, now I'll have to admit a little envy of these guys that walk through the airports and probably have never heard a hostile shot fired, and people stand up and give them a standing ovation. But that's good. Yeah, it's nice to see
the change has come about. Yeah, it's for the better. Yeah.
You know, one of the things I'll never forget, I was at the Command and General Staff College when the first Desert Storm kicked off. You know, Arnold Schwarzkopf. Right. You know, led what we refer to as the 100-hour war. And they have in small staff groups at Fort Leavenworth, and I was in every staff group, if they have a guest speaker come in the evening, has to send at least one representative, because nobody wants to go back in the evening to hear a guest speaker. So I got selected on a particular evening to go back to hear a guest speaker. Well, I went home, turned on the TV, and it was some talk show, and they had these two Air Force pilots that had been prisoners during Desert Storm. One of them had been shot down, and he had been a prisoner for 30 days, and I think the other one had been a prisoner for about 45 days. And they got a standing ovation in Congress. They were part of a ticker tape parade in New York, and good-looking young guys sitting there in their blue uniforms, pretty young wives sitting next to them. And I thought, you know, it's nice to see the patriotism coming back to America. Well, I went in that evening to hear the guest speaker, and I didn't even know who he was. And it was some retired insurance salesman who had been a Navy lieutenant commander and had been a POW for 6.5 years in Vietnam. And I thought, wow. 45 days, 6.5 years. And of course, he came home to a country that treated him like a war criminal.
Yeah, exactly right. Paul, tell us about your family. I know you and your wife, Virginia, have been married, what, close to 50 years now, right? Is that right?
We just celebrated our 47th.
Okay. Yeah. You have 3 sons, is that correct?
2 daughters and 1 son.
Okay, I'm sorry. All right.
I have my youngest daughter is still here. She graduated from UAH, and she works for a psychiatrist here in Huntsville. My son, he's the middle, he's in Portland, Oregon, and my oldest is a daughter in Sacramento, California.
I see.
And
scattered all around.
All around.
Do you get to see them often?
Well, obviously, living on the West Coast, I don't see them that often. I
Right.
try to get out there every couple years. My oldest daughter just went on a cruise with us last summer. We went up to Alaska and took her along. But,
Good. But that was interesting.
Yes,
a lot of
it
fun.
was.
Sure, yeah. How did you wind up in Huntsville? Now, did you retire at Redstone Arsenal after
No,
you started? Okay.
I retired at Fort Lewis, Washington.
Okay.
And there's a couple reasons why I'm in Huntsville. One is my wife's a Texan, and
Okay.
after 6 years in the gray weather of Western Washington, she used to say she lived there 6 years and her feet were never warm.
She was ready to go south, right?
She was ready to go south.
Yeah.
I was offered a job in the Apache program office. You know, I'd worked, 30 years of active duty, all primarily in the helicopter area. I'd worked when this command that's currently here used to be in St. Louis. I had spent 3 or 4 years in St. Louis as an Army major working there in contracting and engineering. And so they offered to move me down here and go to work in the Scout Attack Program office, and we moved and
been here ever since.
been here ever since.
Yeah. When was that? 90? When is that?
2000.
2000. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Paul, in 2013, you became an ordained deacon at Good Shepherd Catholic Church here in Huntsville. Talk about that calling, and had you been considering that for some time?
No, kind of like flying into that hot LZ. I didn't give it a lot of forethought. I always, as I've gotten older, I've tried to surrender my life a little more to the Lord. And the church called me on the phone, as a matter of fact, and said, we'd like you to start this program. It lasts for 4.5 years.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of conversations my wife and I had during that 4.5 years. 1 weekend a month, we'd kind of get locked in down at the monastery in Coleman. You go down on Friday afternoon and stay till Sunday. And there's a lot of drives home on Sunday afternoon that, my wife and I said, are we going to keep doing this? And, the Spirit just continued to pull us down that path. And I was ordained with, I think, 16 or 17 other men on December 7th, 2013. And I've been, Good Shepherd was my home parish. They allowed me to stay there.
Right.
Technically, you take a vow of obedience with the bishop.
Right.
And even though he's down in Birmingham, he usually lets people stay at their home parishes. And it's, almost 1,000 families. I think somewhere between 900 and 1,000 registered families. It's a fairly big church with just one priest and one deacon, and he and I, and stay pretty busy.
Yeah. Paul, when you go to the reunions, now that some of your friends that you serve with know that you're an ordained deacon, the Catholic Church, has their language changed a little bit? Do they not offer you a beer or anything like that? What's changed in that area?
Well, without getting derogatory, I assume you'll edit it if you don't like it. I'm a Catholic,
right?
And having a beer or a glass of wine now and then is not
right.
not sinful,
right?
But the people that I really knew in Vietnam, a whole lot of that has not changed. That's generally the same. Now, some of the people that knew me out on Redstone, I was out there for 14 years as a contractor working in Apache, and some of those guys treat me a little differently. In fact, I mentioned last New Year's, I said, "Holy cow! We used to get invited to all of these New Year's parties and Christmas parties, and nobody's inviting us to anything anymore." And,
yeah, things changed a little bit, didn't
yeah.
it? Last year, 2017, you were inducted into the Madison County Military Heritage Hall of Heroes. What did that induction mean to you? What that recognition? How do you feel about that?
Well, it was very humbling, and to tell you the truth, people had been talking to me about that for a number of years, and I'd always avoided it. I don't normally go to reunions. That one I talked about in 2005 was the last big reunion. Now, I do go to these little get-togethers sometimes with that unit I was with in Vietnam, but that's very casual compared to that.
Sure.
The one I went to in 2005 was the first Cav division. It was big. Haven't returned to anything like that since. But I had avoided the induction primarily because sometimes I get a little uncomfortable when I see a lot of people my age who've almost sometimes not been able to move past Vietnam or past those ugly days.
Right.
And I've moved past all of that, I'm pretty sure. I haven't even... It's very humbling. It was beautiful. The primary motivation was one of the year before, one of the people at our church had gone through, and he's the one that actually worked the nomination for me to go through the process. And you know, I'm not sure how many other people there are around Huntsville that deserve it and haven't been inducted yet. But
well, I think, as we all do, I think it's well deserved, and I know it's certainly a great addition, and we appreciate you doing that and being involved in it. And it was a good ceremony, I have to admit. Yeah,
it was. It was beautiful, and you know, I'll have to tell you that when I walk into a room full of people, full of strangers, I'm not real comfortable. But,
right.
You know.
We're almost going to conclude our interview, but I haven't asked you yet about you're ordained deacon, yet you are really, really into motorcycles. You love your motorcycles, I think, when you were a youngster. Tell us about, you still do some motorcycle racing, or you have some participate in that sort of thing, work on them, or what is your occupation with them, Paul?
Well, I certainly haven't competed in a race in many years. I did race in the 70s. Had a very good friend when I was in Washington, D.C. that ended up leaving the Army. He was an attorney. He left the Army and went into a partnership, bought a motorcycle dealership in Ohio. And they kind of sponsored me for a little while. But I've had I'm on motorcycle number 28 now. The kind of racing I've done is referred to as road racing. You know, on pavement, like a sports car track, except motorcycles. And
speeds exceed what, over 100 miles an hour most?
Oh yeah. In fact, the last race I was in was at Rockingham, North Carolina, which is a NASCAR track, but they'd made the infield set up for motorcycle road racing or sports cars, but they still use one of the big bank turns. And we were hitting probably 130, 140 on a bank turn, and that's real strange on a motorcycle because the suspension goes away. I mean, it's really weird.
I guess I'm a little bit different. I like four wheels under me, you know, most of the time. Paul, our final question, and this I'm sure will hopefully enlighten some young people that may be interested. What advice would you give to young people who may be considering a career in the military? What advice would you give them?
Well, first of all, my last 3 years in the Army, when I was in active duty as a lieutenant colonel, I was the operations officer, the G3 for the Western ROTC region. We had 120 colleges, everything west of the Mississippi River, basically, that had an ROTC program. And I would certainly say anybody who would like to make it a career, if you have the ability, either intellectually and financially, would be to go to college. And if you could, go through ROTC, be an officer, whether it's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. That's the ideal path ahead. if you're some young guy or gal who's just graduated from high school and you don't have the ability or the time or the finances to go to college, then the Army is a wonderful opportunity to get some very, very good training. And as far as the career goes, I'm not sure how many people, except maybe for some of the service academy people, enter the Army or Navy or Air Force and plan to stay for a career. It kind of becomes, that may be their initial intention, but
it grows on you, I guess, you know, after a couple of years. If you, hey, I like this, you know, that sort of thing, yeah.
I mean,
not for everyone, yeah.
I liked flying helicopters and airplanes. Yeah. I mean, they were letting me do something that was really fun. I got to do it all over the world, so. And my poor wife, 21 times we moved since we've been married.
Paul, thank you so much for participating in our oral history interview series and allowing us to preserve your military experience for the people of this community.
You're welcome.
And thank you, sir, for your service to our country. Appreciate it very much.
Very welcome. Thank you very much.
Now, if you'd like more information regarding this interview or any interview in our Military Heritage series, please contact the Madison County Military Heritage Commission website at mcmhc.org. I'm Tom Kennemer. Thank you for being with us.